Orthodoxy indeed is a significant element of Russian identity, and if we look at it, it is reflected both in a great entanglement in history and also in social and political self-awareness of Russia. I don't want, in fact, to bore you too much with historical details, but of course, in order to understand the entanglement of Russian political and religious identity, which we also see now at the moment, we need, of course, to look at the roots and where this comes from. How did it develop? Russian Orthodoxy relies on the baptism of the ancient Rus in 988 by Byzantine Orthodox missionaries. And according to the legend, this baptism took place in the region of today's Kiev or Ukraine. Later, the people and the center of its Orthodoxy moved north to Novgorod, then to Moscow. The spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy, however, remained in Kiev. And until today, the Lavra, a monastery, and the Kiev Theological Academy, they enjoy a very much great respect among faithful and the hierarchy of the church worldwide. Through the centuries, the Orthodox identity of the Russian lands strengthened. This happened through several historical moments of detaching from others, detaching from the Greek tradition and defending Russia against Western influences. There are several moments in history where Russia and the church tried to define itself in demarcation from the other. Religion and politics collaborated in the sense of the Byzantine Symphonia. You have probably heard about this concept, an idea that the ecclesial and the worldly leadership work together, sound in symphony, in order to bring people to salvation. And this idea, what this salvation in fact means, is of course conceptualized by church, but also by the state. It is based on Orthodox dogmatics and by Orthodox dogmatics, and it is framed by the social structures and political strategy of the current or historical situation. The concept of symphony implies also, most importantly, the idea of some loyalty of the church to the political leadership in a wide variety. So there is no definition how this leadership should look like so that the church would be loyal to it, except, of course, the direct persecution of Christianity and denial of Christianity. For a very long time, in fact, there had not been any systematic theological concepts of state-church relationship. If going through history, it gets obvious that the church was always reactive to what the state decided to do. The church, in fact, never shaped the political agenda, but it adapted to it theologically. So there was some developments, some decisions on the political line, and then the church adapted theologically to what is going on and tried to frame it in its theological ideas. The state, on the other side, relied, of course, on the support of the church, even in times where the state separated officially from the church. So like in the 18th and 19th century after the reforms of Peter the Great, or during World War II and afterwards. There have been slogans like the famous Narodnost Samodержavie Pravoslavie, that means orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, or there was the idea of the Third Rome. And these understandings or concepts, they shaped a self-understanding of a people where religious and national or even imperial identity merged in one inseparable. At the beginning of the 20th century, and with the general critical social mood about monarchy and a paternalistic approach to individual needs, the narrow connection between state and church was questioned, in fact. And it was a very historical moment, this beginning of the 20th century, to open Russian Orthodoxy to a wide variety of modern world and of different concepts of society. There was a national council convened in 1917-1918, and this council discussed several remarkable issues, heading for new distance to the church and restructuring centralized structures. In a very crucial moment of history, the church questioned even its loyalty to a state, not friendly to the church. There have been attempts in this council to question those close connections if the state would be unfriendly. And to the church and question the meaning of Christianity for its own means. However, and tragically, indeed, these efforts were crushed by the Bolshevik Revolution. The open persecution of religion in the Soviet Union represented a break in the entangled religious and political identity of Russia. Religion, and especially the Orthodox Church, was persecuted and almost extinguished. For the coming 21st century, the agreement between Stalin and the Church during World War II was decisive. In order to survive the terror by the state and in order to maintain its commitment to Russian statehood, the Church agreed to show loyalty to a dictator. The years of the Cold War caused a massive instrumentalization of the Church by the state and a split in the Church between dissident believers on the one side and priests also dissident, and on the other side, the state-loyal leadership of the Church. The 30 years since the collapse of the socialist system have produced a new strengthening of Russia's Orthodox identity, building on all these historical fundaments, which are now sketched, of course, very in a very little form. But this history has been, of course, a rich history of successful collaboration in the interest of a strong, unified Orthodox statehood. And there has also been a rich history of effective, also theologically, ideas and concepts to marginalize or othering dissent voices. So this is very crucial to understand that the history of church-state collaboration in Russia through the centuries has also formed some systematic approaches to marginalize voices which do not fit into the main agenda of the church and of the state. And this process of increasing religiously shaped identity in the 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, this process is negotiated on several levels. In terms of people's religiosity, now, today, we see similar processes as in most Western societies in Western Europe. We have a decreasing institutional commitment. We have individualization and a declining authority of religious moral norms in the private sphere. So if you look for statistics, there are numbers which show that the individual commitment to religious moral norms is not very high. It does not really differ from what we see, for example, in Germany. However, about 70% of the population identify as Orthodox. But even these numbers diminished in the recent years after COVID and after the problematic stance of the church leadership to the civil protests in Russia and in Belarus in 2020. This identification is not related to religiosity. So if you look for mass attendance, minimal knowledge of church teachings, prayer, etc., you don't see those numbers of 70 or 60% reflected. We have maybe 5, maybe 10 in a very maximum who are really religious people in that sense. Starting from 1997 and the new law on religion implemented that year, church and state tied Orthodox and political identity stronger together in order to counter political and religious fragmentation, which was going on in the 90s in Russia. The introduction of traditional religions in this law, that means religions inherently close to Russian identity, kicked off a process of intertwining both identities. In the following years after 97, the church developed two interconnected concepts which subsequently served as a foundation for state ideology. The first is an elaboration on the idea of clash of civilizations and the culture war idea. It was reframed, these American concepts were reframed as an essential difference between liberal and traditional values. And in this concept, the Slavic Orthodox world is the keeper of these traditional values, while the liberal and decadent West illustrates moral decay and represents a threat for the people truly faithful to God. The second concept is the idea of the Russian world. This idea refers to the historical territory of the ancient Rus and constructs a space determined by Orthodox faith and values. This space includes in a first step the territories of today's Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And in a second step, it stretches to the borders of the Russian Empire and finally the Soviet Union. During the late 1990s and as a result of the religious contestation in the situation of religious freedom, the church developed its idea of a canonical territory based on a canonical, so church law understanding that no two Orthodox churches should have structures and mission on the same territory. The church, however, expanded this idea to other Christian confessions and finally also to other worldviews. In connection with the Russian world concept, we see a spatial claim to determine the spiritual and moral orientation of people in a certain historical perspective. Remarkable, this claim by the church has no ethnical or national connotation. On the contrary, it is explicitly transnational. Exactly this transnational outreach makes it easily applicable to an ideology which ignores national sovereignty and nurtures the dream of a new empire. The main actor in these processes was from the 90s onwards the then Metropolitan Kirill Gundyaev, head of the External Affairs Office of the Church since 1989, and since 2009, the Patriarch of Moscow. Kirill participated in several crucial initiatives to back up the theological ideas behind the Russian world and the value discourse. One is the World Russian People's Council, as an example, founded in 1996 as a platform for Orthodox civil society to discuss social issues. The council developed into an instrument of simulated civil society and an ultra-conservative think tank with very strong ties to the World Council of Families and other international ultra-conservative networks. Another noteworthy initiative is the Russian World Foundation, a branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the task to disseminate Russian language and culture in the world. Metropolitan Kirill gave a programmatic speech at the opening of the foundation in 2007 and drew the lines of this global project. It is also important to notice the strong connections the church developed in the ecumenical sphere. Metropolitan Kirill was known for his ecumenical openness, especially with the Roman Catholic Church. His successor in the Office for External Church Issues, Metropolitan Hilarion, fostered these relations and came up with a so-called strategic alliance with the Vatican, as well as with US evangelical actors in defending traditional values. These interconfessional ties point to the theological challenge because the Russian Orthodox Church has at the same time a very conservative understanding of ecumenism. So here's the question of the so-called bad ecumenism or ecumenism 2.0. From a theological point of view, the concepts of the church seem quite weak and may be easily questioned from Orthodox as well as from Catholic theology. And this is why the development of the ideological concepts has been significantly pushed by a new alliance with the authoritarian state since the beginning of Vladimir Putin's rule. Without discussing here Putin's religiosity, it is obvious that he used the institutional church as a pillar for his own political strategy, as well as the church used Putin's need for an ideological legitimation for its own purposes, namely resisting growing religious irrelevance in a secular and plural world. With the support of different structures of the government, the church increased its public presence and influence in matters of Russian identity. We have seen a major joint strategy to rewrite Russian history in order to make breaks, dark and inglorious moments, and the ever-present entanglement with Western currents through history invisible. The church launched at least one very effective tool of usable history with the canonization of the new martyrs, believers who were murdered during the Great Terror because of their faith. Today, these new saints serve as an instrument to avoid further research and further processing of the murderous Soviet system. Of equal importance is the collaboration with the armed forces. Almost no political sphere gained so much attention and official agreements from the church since 1990. The highlight so far is the main cathedral of the armed forces near Moscow in a park called Patriot. The composition of this huge church is a tribute to the victorious history of the Russian army from the 18th century on until the annexation of Crimea. In fact, it is the first time the church somehow presented at least some assessment of the events of 2014. Until then, no comment was made on the annexation of Crimea. Patriarch Kirill has underlined several times the positive meaning of nuclear arms in order to defend the fatherland and everything holy to us. Finally, the question of traditional values has shaped a huge part of domestic repressive politics during the last decade. The state's suppression of freedom of expression, social diversity, and global openness is all too often justified with a fight against evil external forces which try to destroy Russia and the Orthodox civilization. All these topics shaped the domestic agenda of Russia for quite a long time now. However, with the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of Russian war in Ukraine in 2014, a shift happened. This shift prompted at the same time the fail of the Russian world ideology and the start of an aggressive and nationalistic ideology. The Russian world ideology failed due to the fact that the church always refused to subscribe to its Russian world concept, to the state's concept, which neglected national borders. So the church was very, very eager to say that it respects national borders while the state violated those national borders. The invasion in Ukraine under the flag of Russian world would have caused a loss of the huge Orthodox community in Ukraine under the flag, would have caused a loss of the huge Orthodox community in Ukraine for the Moscow Patriarchate. And that's why the church since 2014 does not refer to the concept of Russian world anymore, although its transnational agenda remains. We see it, for example, in the offensive activities in Africa right now. The new strategy behind this international engagement is called persecuted Christians and follows the logic of a civilizational conflict between secular liberal forces and true faithful. As for the ideological collaboration with the Russian state, which could have suffered a crisis after Crimea, church and state found new ways. In 2020, the Orthodox Church succeeded implementing God, a traditional understanding of family, and the notion of Russians as state-forming people in the newly approved constitution. Christina Stöckel, a colleague and very competent scholar on all of those issues of ideology, Christina Stöckel suggests that these amendments in the constitution in favor of an Orthodox understanding, they, here I quote, they signal the end of the tension-ridden, ambivalent, and ultimately open era of post-Soviet Russian Orthodoxy, and the redefinition and closure of the Russian Orthodox Church as a national church. So in this perspective, and I close here, the position of the Russian Orthodox Church is the now escalated war in Ukraine is logical, but not less disturbing, of course. After years of joint efforts to construct the ideology based on Orthodox teaching, the Church is now unable to distance itself from the murderous regime. Under the current circumstances of repression in Russia, it is hard or impossible to say if the Church leadership actually does support the war or just tries to avoid trouble. But the reference to evil external forces threatening the unity of Holy Rus and the active support of refugees from the Donbass shows that the Church uses its ideology to rather support the state propaganda of a defensive act than to take pastoral responsibility of its own flock in Ukraine. So far, my presentation. Thank you for your attention.